Picture this. You're standing outside Andrew Carnegie's Fifth Avenue mansion in 1902, clutching a brown envelope allegedly containing $5 million in promissory notes from the steel magnate himself. You're not his daughter. You've never met him. You don't even share his last name. But within 2 years, you'll have convinced some of America's most respected bankers to hand over the equivalent of $16.5 million in today's money, all based on this one audacious lie. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. Tonight, we're meeting Cassie Chadwick, a woman who understood something that modern scammers are still learning. People don't believe what makes sense. They believe what they want to believe. And if you're rich enough, eccentric enough, and confident enough, you can convince anyone of anything, even that you're the secret illegitimate daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the world. This isn't a story about a clever woman who outsmarted a few gullible victims. This is about a master manipulator who exposed the entire financial system's willingness to suspend disbelief when there's money to be made. She forged documents, invented identities, faked her own death multiple times, married strategically, and built an empire of lies so elaborate that even after she was caught, some of her victims still weren't entirely sure she was lying. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Now, let's meet Elizabeth Bigley, the woman who became Cassie Chadwick, and discover how a Canadian farm girl with a hearing impairment and a gift for forgery became the greatest conwoman the Gilded Age ever produced. In the spring of 1902, a woman known as Cassie L. Chadwick embarked on a journey from the smoky streets of Cleveland to the bustling avenues of New York City, carrying with her nothing but audacity, a well-tailored dress, and a plan so outrageous it could only work in the Gilded Age, when wealth was worshipped like a religion, and asking too many questions was considered vulgar. She arrived at the Holland House, a beacon of luxury at the corner of 30th Street and 5th Avenue. The kind of establishment where even the marble floors had better breeding than most people. The hotel was famed for its opulent banquet room and an extravagant wine cellar valued at $350,000, roughly $11 million today, which is an obscene amount of money to spend on wine storage, but this was the Gilded Age, when excess wasn't just acceptable, it was the entire point. As Cassie lingered in the lobby, her high-button shoes tapping against the sienna marble floor, she scanned the crowd for a particular face. She needed a witness for what was about to happen, someone respectable, someone who could be trusted to spread exactly the right kind of gossip. And there he was. James Dillon, a lawyer and friend of her husband, standing somewhat aloof, probably thinking about contracts or property law or whatever lawyers thought about in 1902 when they weren't actively being manipulated by con artists. Cassie approached him subtly, brushing his arm as if by chance, executing the kind of accidental encounter that people still use on dating apps today, except with more elaborate clothing and significantly higher stakes. When Dillon turned, she feigned surprise with the practiced ease of someone who'd been lying professionally for decades, exclaiming what a delightful coincidence it was to encounter him so far from home. She was briefly in the city, she explained with careful vagueness, on some private business. Could Mr. Dillon possibly escort her to her father's house? It was a simple request, the kind any gentleman would agree to without thinking twice. Dillon, obliging as ever, and completely unaware that he was about to become a crucial pawn in one of history's most audacious cons, flagged down an open carriage. Cassie directed the driver to 2 East 91st Street at 5th Avenue, and then settled in for the ride, maintaining lively banter all the way. She talked about Cleveland society, about mutual acquaintances, about anything except where they were actually going and why. Dillon participated in the conversation, but was struck increasingly silent as the carriage progressed uptown, as the neighborhoods became progressively wealthier, as the houses became progressively more palatial, until finally they arrived at their destination. And then Dillon realized whose home it was. The mansion belonged to Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate whose wealth was so vast that trying to count it would be like trying to count stars. Technically possible, but essentially pointless. Carnegie was one of the richest men not just in America, but in the entire world. A man who owned steel mills the way other people owned houseplants, casually and in concerning quantities. Dylan must have experienced several rapid thoughts in succession. Confusion about why they were here, curiosity about Cassie's connection to this place, and the dawning realization that whatever was happening was either very important or very strange, possibly both. Cassie excused herself from the carriage, claiming she would return shortly, and approached the butler with the ease of someone who absolutely belonged there, someone for whom visiting Carnegie's mansion was as natural as visiting a corner store. Her confidence was total, unshakable, the kind of confidence that opens doors because people assume you wouldn't have that confidence unless you had every right to it. Inside the mansion, and we have to admire the sheer nerve required to walk into Andrew Carnegie's house uninvited, Cassie told the head housekeeper that she was considering hiring a former Carnegie maid named Hilda Schmidt. She provided a detailed description. Young, blonde, German accent, excellent with laundry, prone to singing while she worked. It was all completely fabricated, every single detail invented on the spot, with the casual creativity of someone writing fiction in real time. The housekeeper, despite Cassie's confident inquiries and her intimate knowledge of how to describe a household servant convincingly, confirmed that no such person had ever been employed there. Not now, not recently, not ever. There was no Hilda Schmidt. There had never been a Hilda Schmidt. The name meant nothing. Cassie gracefully accepted this clarification without missing a beat, praised the home's cleanliness, because always compliment the help. It's just good manners even when you're actively committing fraud, and left with a large brown envelope cleverly concealed under her coat. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That envelope? She'd brought it with her. She hadn't obtained anything from Carnegie's mansion, except perhaps a brief glimpse at how the other half lived, and confirmation that she could talk her way past household staff with remarkable ease. But Dylan didn't know that. Dylan thought she'd gone inside for legitimate business, thought she'd received something, thought there was an actual connection between this woman and one of the world's richest men. Once back in the carriage, Dylan, who had been sitting in progressively more confused silence, ventured to ask who her father was. It was a reasonable question. You don't escort someone to Andrew Carnegie's mansion without eventually wondering about the nature of that connection. Cassie placed a finger to her lips in the universal gesture for "this is a secret," which immediately makes whatever you're about to say seem more important and more true, a psychological trick that still works today. She urged secrecy with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested this was information of monumental importance, information that could change everything if it became public knowledge. Then she dropped the bomb. She claimed to be the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. The envelope she revealed with carefully calibrated reluctance, as if she hadn't wanted to tell him but simply had to confide in someone, contained promissory notes for substantial sums and securities amounting to $5 million, about $165 million in today's money, all supposedly gifts from her guilt-ridden father. Moreover, she was poised to inherit a fortune upon his death, which given Carnegie's age and wealth could be any day now and would be spectacularly lucrative. She implored Dylan to keep her secret, knowing with absolute certainty that he would do nothing of the sort. That's the genius of the "tell no one" instruction. It transforms gossip into a special privilege, makes the listener feel important and trusted, ensures they'll immediately tell everyone they know because humans are fundamentally terrible at keeping secrets, especially interesting secrets. Dylan, like every person who's ever been told a scandalous secret they've been instructed not to share, probably lasted about 48 hours before telling his wife, who told her friends, who told their husbands, who told their business associates, and within a week, all of Cleveland's elite society knew that Cassie Chadwick was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. The beauty of this con was its simplicity. Cassie bore no relation to Carnegie. She'd never met him, never corresponded with him, never been within speaking distance of him, except for that one time she walked into his house uninvited and lied to his housekeeper. Her name wasn't even Cassie. That was just her latest alias, in a lifelong career of reinvention and fraud. She was, in fact, the greatest conwoman of the Gilded Age, and she was just getting started. Elizabeth Betty Bigley was born in October 1857, the fifth of 8 children, into circumstances that were comfortable but nowhere near wealthy, on a small farm in Eastwood, Ontario, Canada. Her childhood was marked by the kind of ordinary rural life that produces either extremely honest, hard-working people or criminal masterminds, depending on temperament and opportunity. Betty was neither the oldest nor the youngest, neither the prettiest nor the plainest, the kind of middle child who could easily fade into the background of family life, unremarkable and easily overlooked. Except for 2 defining characteristics that would shape her entire approach to life and crime. As a young girl, Betty lost hearing in one ear, possibly from illness, possibly from injury, the historical record isn't clear, and developed a speech impediment as a consequence. In an era when any physical defect could mark you as different, as lesser, as someone to be pitied or mocked, these afflictions conditioned Betty to speak few words and choose them with extreme care. If you can't speak fluently, you learn to make every word count. If people struggle to understand you, you learn to communicate through other means, through intensity of gaze, through calculated silences, through the careful construction of mystery. Betty's disabilities became her greatest assets, transforming what could have been limitations into tools of manipulation. Her classmates found her peculiar, which is child speak for different in ways that make us uncomfortable. She turned inward, sitting in silence by the hour, which her family interpreted as daydreaming or depression, but which was actually something far more interesting and concerning. One sister, Alice, who would later feature prominently, and unfortunately in Betty's early schemes, said Betty often seemed to be in a trance, as if she had hypnotized herself, unable to see or hear anything that existed outside her mind. Coming out of these spells, Betty seemed disoriented and bewildered, like someone returning from a very long journey to a very different place. But she refused to discuss her thoughts, refused to explain where her mind went during these episodes, and maintained an impenetrable silence about her internal world. In retrospect, this sounds exactly like someone planning elaborate schemes, someone mentally rehearsing cons and scenarios, someone building entire fictional worlds in her head that she would later bring to life through fraud and forgery. Sometimes Alice noticed Betty practicing family members' signatures, scrawling the names over and over again with the focused attention of someone learning a crucial skill. This should have been a massive red flag, the kind of warning sign that suggests your sister is planning something criminal. But families have a remarkable ability to explain away troubling behavior, to assume the best, to tell themselves that surely their loved one isn't planning to forge documents. Surely she's just practicing penmanship, very specific penmanship. At the age of 13, which is an age when most people are worried about homework and social acceptance, not perpetrating financial fraud, Betty devised her first scheme. She wrote a letter purporting to be from a Canadian law firm, informing herself that an uncle had died and left her a small sum of money. The letter was formal, legally worded, complete with official-sounding language about estates and beneficiaries. It looked authentic enough to dupe a local bank, which issued checks allowing her to spend the inheritance money in advance of actually receiving it. The checks were genuine, issued by a real bank. The accounts, however, were non-existent, based entirely on a fictional inheritance from a fictional uncle. Betty had discovered something profound. If you create convincing enough paperwork, institutions will believe you. They'll process your requests, issue you money, trust that you're telling the truth. Because who would go to this much trouble to lie? After a few months of spending money she didn't have on things she didn't need, Betty was arrested. She was 13 years old, facing her first criminal charge, and probably should have been terrified. Instead, she was warned never to do it again and released, which sent exactly the wrong message. The message she received was, "You got caught, but the consequences were minimal. Try harder next time." So she did. In 1879, at the age of 22, Betty launched what would become her trademark scam, the template she'd use with variations for the rest of her criminal career. She'd learned from her teenage mistake. This time, Everything would be more elaborate, more professional, more convincing. She saved up money, likely through small cons and petty theft, though the historical record is unclear, for expensive letterhead, the kind of high-quality stationery that professional firms used, with embossed text and watermarks that suggested legitimacy and permanence. Using the fictitious name and address of a London, Ontario attorney she'd completely invented, she notified herself that a philanthropist had died and left her an inheritance of $15,000. $15,1879 is roughly $450,000 today, which is an absurdly large amount of money to claim you've inherited, the kind of sum that should trigger intense scrutiny. But Betty understood something crucial about human psychology. The bigger the lie, the more believable it becomes, because people assume no one would dare fabricate something that outrageous unless it were true. The letter was perfect. Legal language, proper formatting, an air of bureaucratic inevitability. It looked exactly like what a notification of inheritance should look like, because Betty had studied real examples, understood the conventions, knew how to mimic authenticity. Next, she needed to announce her good fortune publicly, to present herself in a manner that would allow her to spend this fictional inheritance without anyone questioning where the money came from. In the Gilded Age, wealthy people announced their status through calling cards, small, elegant cards with your name and sometimes a brief descriptor used when visiting or being introduced in social situations. Betty had a printer create business cards resembling these elite calling cards. Hers read, in elegant script, "Miss Bigley, heir to $15,000. Think about the brilliance of this. A calling card that literally announced her wealth, that preemptively answered any questions about whether she could afford expensive purchases. It was advertising and authentication in one small piece of cardstock, and it worked perfectly. She came up with a simple plan that capitalized on the lackadaisical business practices of the day, when commerce operated largely on trust and personal reputation rather than modern systems of credit verification and background. Betty would enter a shop, a dress shop, a furniture store, a jeweler, choose an expensive item, and then write a check for a sum that exceeded its price. Let's say a dress cost $50. She'd write a check for $75 and ask for the $25 difference in cash. Many merchants were willing to provide this service, essentially treating their stores like primitive ATMs, giving customers cash back on purchases. It was convenient for customers who needed spending money and didn't want to visit a bank. It was also incredibly easy to exploit. If anyone questioned whether Miss Bigley could afford her purchases, and in an era when young women's finances were typically controlled by fathers or husbands, this was a reasonable question. She coolly produced her calling card. Miss Bigley, heir to $15,000. It worked every time. Why would a young woman have a card announcing she was an heiress if it weren't true? You wouldn't print lies on your calling card. That would be dishonest. That would be fraud. Surely Miss Bigley was legitimate. The scam was elegant in its simplicity. She'd buy a $50 dress with a $75 check, get $25 cash. Do this at 10 stores in a day, and you've extracted $250 in cash plus $500 in merchandise, all based on checks drawn on accounts that contained exactly $0. Eventually, the checks would bounce, but by then, Betty had moved on to the next town, the next scheme, the next identity. After exhausting the merchants of Ontario, Betty decided to expand her operations. She headed to Cleveland to live with her sister Alice, who had married and was trying to establish a respectable household with her new husband. Betty promised Alice she didn't want to impose on the newlyweds, which was already a lie, and would stay only as long as it took to launch herself, a deliberately vague phrase that Alice interpreted as finding legitimate employment, perhaps a job at a factory or shop, something respectable for a young woman. While Alice believed her sister was job hunting, Betty was doing something very different, roaming the house and taking inventory. She examined everything from chairs to cutlery to paintings, estimating their value with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years assessing what could be stolen or leveraged. She created a detailed mental catalogue of Alice's household goods, assigned them inflated values, because banks rarely verified these estimates, and then arranged for a bank loan using her sister's furnishings as collateral. Imagine the audacity. You take out a loan using furniture that doesn't belong to you in a house where you're a guest, against the property of your own sister who'd generously given you a place to stay. The betrayal is stunning. The nerve required almost admirable in its completeness. When Alice's husband discovered the ruse, probably when the bank contacted him about the loan he knew nothing about, asking him to make payments on money he hadn't borrowed, he immediately kicked Betty out. She moved to another neighborhood in Cleveland, completely unbothered by having just defrauded her own family, ready for the next phase of her perpetually evolving con. In her new Cleveland neighborhood, Betty met Dr. Wallace S. Springsteen, a physician who was about to make a terrible mistake based on excellent cheekbones and mysterious eyes. The doctor was immediately captivated. By all contemporary accounts, Betty was rather plain. She had a tight, unsmiling mouth and a nest of dull brown hair that she wore in severe, unflattering styles. She wasn't beautiful by conventional standards, but her eyes had a singular intensity that newspapers would later dub hypnotic, and the gentle lisp of her voice, a consequence of her childhood speech impediment, seemed to impart a quiet truth to her every word. People believed her when she spoke, not because what she said was particularly believable, but because the way she said it suggested profound sincerity. Her disabilities had become her greatest weapons. She and Dr. Springsteen married before a justice of the peace in December 1883, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, doing what newspapers have always done, which is announce things that will later prove embarrassing, printed a notice of their union. The marriage lasted exactly 12 days. Within days of the wedding, furious merchants began showing up at the couple's home, demanding to be repaid for purchases Betty had made using fraudulent checks. They arrived with invoices, with bounced checks, with increasing levels of anger as they realized they'd been swindled by the doctor's new wife. Dr. Springsteen, confronted with undeniable evidence of his wife's criminal activity, checked the merchants' stories and begrudgingly paid off Betty's debts, fearing that his own credit and reputation were on the line. He was a respected physician, a professional man, someone whose standing in the community mattered. Having a criminal wife was professionally devastating. The marriage dissolved almost as quickly as it had been formed. Dr. Springsteen presumably learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of marrying someone based solely on intense eye contact and mysterious lisping. And Betty learned that marriage could be a useful tool for accessing other people's money and credit. She was just getting started, in a life marked by perpetual reinvention, and at this point, Betty had already been several different people, accumulated at least 3 last names, and left a trail of bad checks across 2 countries. She assumed the mantle of Marie Rosa. The name itself was a performance, exotic and mysterious, suggesting European sophistication or perhaps romantic tragedy. She began weaving her way through various boarding houses, refining her craft on unsuspecting merchants and landladies, always moving before the consequences of her actions could catch up with her. Her journey led her to Erie, Pennsylvania, where she conjured a tale that demonstrated her increasing ambition. She claimed to be the niece of Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman, the man who'd marched through Georgia burning everything in sight and generally terrifying the Confederacy into submission. Sherman was famous, feared, and respected. Claiming relation to him instantly elevated your social standing, suggested important connections, implied wealth and influence. It was the 1880s equivalent of claiming to be related to a celebrity, except with more elaborate backstories and fewer ways to verify the truth. Marie Rosa's act in Erie included a dramatic illness that showcased her true talents as a performer. She convinced onlookers of her suffering by drawing blood from her gums, yes, deliberately injuring herself, to simulate a hemorrhage, creating the appearance that she was coughing up blood, that she was seriously, perhaps fatally ill. This required both physical self-harm and exceptional acting ability. You have to make yourself bleed, then convince people you're dying from some mysterious internal ailment, all while maintaining enough composure to manipulate the situation to your advantage. It's an acting method taken to a criminal extreme. Moved by her supposed plight, because people in the 1880s were apparently very willing to believe that young women were constantly dying of mysterious ailments, the compassionate citizens of Erie generously offered funds to aid her return to Cleveland, where she claimed she needed to see a specialist, to be with family, to die in comfort, if dying was indeed her fate. She gratefully accepted their money, promised to repay them once she recovered or settled her affairs, and left Erie with their cash and their sympathy. When the Erie citizens later sought repayment, because even in the 1880s, people eventually wanted their money back, they received letters mourning the unfortunate demise of Marie Rosa, allegedly just 2 weeks after her departure from their city. The letters were heartfelt, tragic, written by a family friend, expressing deep sorrow at poor Marie's passing. They included details about her final days, her suffering, her gratitude for the kindness shown by the people of Erie. They were moving, genuine seeming, and completely fictional, penned by Betty herself, complete with a heartfelt eulogy to her own alias. She'd killed off a character like a novelist ending a storyline, except the character was her, and the novel was her life. Not content with simply being a deceased relation of General Sherman, Betty reinvented herself again as Madame Rosa, now claiming clairvoyant powers. The Gilded Age had a fascinating obsession with spiritualism, seances, and fortune-telling, largely because many people, particularly women who'd lost loved ones in the Civil War, desperately wanted to believe in life after death, in the possibility of communication with the departed, in powers beyond the material world. Madame Rosa provided that comfort, for a price. She told fortunes, communicated with the dead, provided guidance about the future, and generally exploited grief and hope in equal measure. It was a profitable business model that also provided excellent opportunities for meeting wealthy, emotionally vulnerable people. She entangled herself romantically with 2 of her clients, because apparently scamming people wasn't enough. She needed to marry them too. The first marriage was to a Trumbull County farmer, a brief union that swiftly disintegrated, probably because farmers have this annoying habit of expecting their wives to actually work rather than just take their money and leave. The marriage left no significant trace except another name change and another abandoned husband. The second marriage, to businessman C.L. Hoover, proved more consequential in every way. The union produced a son, Emile, whom Betty sent to Canada to be raised by her family, which tells you everything you need to know about her maternal instincts and priorities. Having a child was apparently fine as long as someone else raised him and he didn't interfere with her various criminal enterprises. Upon Hoover's death in 1888, Betty inherited $50,000, about $1.5 million in today's money, a genuine fortune that facilitated another transformation. This was perhaps her first legitimate windfall, money she'd acquired through marriage rather than fraud, though one suspects her husband's premature death may not have been entirely coincidental. The historical record is conveniently silent on the circumstances of Hoover's demise. Flush with Hoover's inheritance, Betty relocated to Toledo and adopted the identity of Madame Lydia Dare, continuing her clairvoyant escapades with renewed capital and confidence. In Toledo, she ensnared Joseph Lamb, a well-regarded local businessman who should have known better but apparently didn't. She persuaded him to cash forged promissory notes, essentially fake IOUs, under the pretense of her urgent need for cash. The notes totaled a staggering $40,000, about $1.3 million today, which was an absolutely enormous sum to hand over based on nothing more than good faith and a convincing performance by a fake psychic. The scheme unraveled, as these things inevitably do. Betty had gotten greedy, taken too much money too quickly from too prominent a victim. Arrests followed. Lamb was eventually exonerated, viewed as another victim of Lydia's mesmerizing deceit. He'd been tricked, bamboozled, hypnotized by this mysterious woman and her compelling lies. Betty, however, faced conviction for forgery and received a sentence of 9.5 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. Most criminals would view this as a major setback, a sign to perhaps reconsider their life choices. Betty viewed it as a temporary inconvenience and an opportunity to practice her craft in new settings. Even behind bars, her persona as a seer did not falter. She continued to present herself as someone with supernatural powers, and she demonstrated these powers in ways that absolutely terrified the prison staff. She foretold misfortune for the warden, specifically predicting he would lose $5,000 and eventually die from cancer. Both prophecies came to pass, which either means Betty actually had psychic powers or made a lucky guess based on the fact that wardens handle money and cancer was a common cause of death. The prison population, naturally, was convinced she had genuine supernatural abilities. Her manipulation reached the parole board through a series of letters expressing contrition and promising reform. She wrote beautifully, eloquently, about her remorse, her desire to change, her understanding that she'd done wrong and needed to make amends. The letters were compelling enough that Governor William McKinley, the future President of the United States, who would later be assassinated, so perhaps he should have been more careful about who he trusted, granted her an early release after just 3.5 years. Betty had served barely a third of her sentence before convincing the governor to let her out. She'd committed forgery, served minimal time, and emerged ready for her greatest con yet. Betty's return to Cleveland marked her most ambitious transformation. She became Cassie L. Hoover, combining her previous alias with her late second husband's name, and set her sights on Dr. Leroy S. Chadwick, a wealthy widower and scion of one of Cleveland's founding families. Dr. Chadwick was lonely, elderly, suffering from rheumatism, and extremely wealthy. He was, in other words, the perfect target. Cassie's past was rumored and dark. Whispers suggested she'd once owned a brothel. Hints indicated the lonely doctor had been her client. Stories circulated that her therapeutic touch for his rheumatic back had evolved into something more personal. Whether any of this was true is unclear, but it paints a picture of a relationship based on need, convenience, and mutual benefit rather than romance. They married, and Cassie moved her son Emil into the grandeur of the Chadwick Mansion on Euclid Avenue, Cleveland's most prestigious street, where millionaires built their elaborate homes and competed to display their wealth in increasingly ridiculous ways. Cassie played the role of the doctor's compassionate wife, with the skill of a professional actress, presenting a facade that concealed her rumored past and criminal present. The city's elite, including relations of John D. Rockefeller, U.S., Senator Marcus Hanna, and John Hay, who had been one of Abraham Lincoln's private secretaries, remained oblivious to the true depths of her scheming nature. They saw what she wanted them to see: a devoted wife, a gracious hostess, a woman of means and refinement. The new Cassie L. Chadwick was eager to impress her prominent neighbors and to live in a style that matched their extravagance. She bought everything that struck her fancy and never asked the price, which is the ultimate flex in any era. The ability to purchase without concern for cost signals, wealth so vast that money becomes meaningless. She replaced Dr. Chadwick's musty drapes and gloomy oil portraits with bright, whimsical pieces that probably horrified the doctor but delighted Cassie. She purchased a perpetual motion clock encased in glass, a $9,000 pipe organ, roughly $300,000 today, and a musical chair that plunked out a tune when someone sat down, which is simultaneously charming and annoying. Her jewelry collection was legendary: a chest containing 8 trays of diamonds and pearls, inventoried at $98,000, and a $40,000 rope of pearls. She ordered custom-made hats and clothing from New York, sculptures from the Far East, and furniture from Europe, creating an elaborate display of wealth that impressed her neighbors and horrified her husband. During the Christmas season of 1903, the year after James Dillon told all of Cleveland about her shocking connection to Andrew Carnegie, she bought 8 pianos at a time and presented them as gifts to friends. 8 pianos. Who needs 8 pianos? No one needs 8 pianos. But that was precisely the point: excess for its own sake, generosity as performance, wealth displayed so extravagantly that it became its own validation. Even when purchasing the smallest toiletries, she insisted on paying top dollar. If a thing didn't cost enough to suit her, one acquaintance reported, she would order it thrown away. This is perhaps the purest expression of Gilded Age values. Something was only valuable if it was expensive, and if it wasn't expensive enough, it had no value at all. When Dr. Chadwick began objecting to her profligacy, because even wealthy people eventually notice when their spouses are spending money like it's going out of style, Cassie had a ready solution. She borrowed against her future inheritance from Andrew Carnegie. This is where the Holland House encounter becomes crucial. Because of James Dillon's inability to keep a secret, because of human nature's tendency to spread scandalous information, everyone in Cleveland's elite circles now knew that Cassie was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, that she would inherit millions, that her current spending was merely an advance against guaranteed future wealth. Her scam involved extracting large sums of money from financial institutions across multiple states. She targeted Ohio Citizens Bank, Cleveland's Wade Park Banking Company, and New York's Lincoln National Bank for the largest loans, while also obtaining smaller sums, though never less than $10,000, because apparently she had standards, from as many as a dozen other banks. The scheme was elegant in its structure. She would take out several loans, repaying the first with money from the second, repaying the second with money from the third, and so on. It's called a Ponzi scheme today, though Charles Ponzi wouldn't make it famous until 1920. Cassie was ahead of her time. She chose Wade Park Bank as her base of operations, entrusting it with her counterfeit promissory notes supposedly from Carnegie. The notes were elaborate forgeries, complete with Carnegie's forged signature, legal language, and official-looking seals. They looked legitimate enough that bank officials accepted them as collateral without ever actually verifying with Carnegie that he'd signed them. She convinced Charles Beckwith, the president of Citizens National Bank, to grant her a loan of $240,000 plus an additional $100,000 from his personal account. Think about that. The bank president was so convinced by her story that he not only approved a massive institutional loan, but added his own money to it. That's not just professional judgment failing, that's complete personal investment in the con. A Pittsburgh steel mogul, likely an acquaintance of Carnegie's in the steel industry, who thought he was doing business with Carnegie's daughter, gave her $800,000. That's roughly $26 million in today's money, handed over based on nothing more than forged documents and convincing lies. Through Cleveland's prestigious Euclid Avenue Baptist Church, because Cassie understood that churches were excellent places to meet wealthy, trusting people. She connected with Herbert Newton, an investment banker from Boston who was thrilled to provide her with loans. Newton wrote her a check from his business for $79,000 and a personal check for $25,000, totaling $104,000. He was even more pleased when she signed a promissory note for $109,800 without questioning the outrageous interest, which should have been his first clue that something wasn't right. When someone's willing to pay 50% interest on a short-term loan, they're either desperate or lying. In Cassie's case, she was lying about even intending to pay it back. By November 1904, Herbert Newton realized what every person who's ever been conned eventually realizes: the money wasn't coming back. Cassie had no intention of repaying the loans, let alone any interest. She'd taken his money, spent it on pianos and jewelry and ridiculous musical chairs, and was living a life of extravagance while he waited for repayment that would never come. Newton filed suit in federal court in Cleveland, which immediately became front-page news. The lawsuit named Cassie Chadwick as a fraud, detailed the enormous sums she'd borrowed, and most importantly, requested that Ira Reynolds, secretary and treasurer of Wade Park Banking Company, who had himself lent most of his personal fortune to Cassie, continue to hold the promissory notes supposedly from Andrew Carnegie as security, in order to prevent Cassie from moving her assets and hiding her money before the case went to trial. The lawsuit essentially froze everything, trapped the physical evidence in place, and ensured that those Carnegie promissory notes would be available for examination. This was the beginning of the end. Once one victim came forward publicly, others began to realize they'd been conned too. It's like when one person admits they invested in a pyramid scheme. Suddenly everyone else who invested starts asking uncomfortable questions about why they haven't seen any returns. Cassie, faced with a federal lawsuit and mounting public scrutiny, did what she'd always done when caught. She lied with absolute confidence. She denied all charges. She denied owing Newton money. And most brazenly, she denied any relationship whatsoever with Andrew Carnegie. It has been said repeatedly that I had asserted that Andrew Carnegie was my father, she told reporters with the indignant air of someone who'd been terribly wronged. I deny that, and I deny it absolutely. This was a fascinating strategy. She'd built her entire con on being Carnegie's daughter, had told everyone who would listen about this connection, had used this supposed relationship to extract millions of dollars from multiple banks. And now, confronted with the consequences, she simply denied it ever happened. It's the, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes defense? Except in this case, it was, who are you going to believe, me, or literally everyone in Cleveland who heard me say I was Carnegie's daughter? The newspapers were having a field day. This was the greatest scandal Cleveland had seen in years, possibly ever. A respected doctor's wife, a prominent society woman, was being accused of massive fraud. The amounts were staggering. The victims were prestigious. And most importantly, it involved Andrew Carnegie, one of the most famous men in America, which guaranteed national coverage. Cassie was arrested and held in the Cuyahoga County Jail while awaiting trial. And even there, even after being caught, even after the entire scheme had collapsed around her, she maintained her mystique. Charles Beckwith, the bank president, whose institution had collapsed because of her fraud, whose personal wealth had been decimated by the loans he'd personally guaranteed, visited her in jail. He stood outside her cell and looked at her through the bars. This woman who had destroyed him financially, and he said something remarkable. You've ruined me, but I'm not so sure yet you are a fraud. Think about that. His bank had failed. His personal fortune was gone. He had undeniable evidence that she'd forged documents, lied about her connection to Carnegie, taken money she'd never intended to repay. And still, some part of him wasn't entirely convinced she was lying. That's the mark of a truly great conwoman. Even after being caught, even after the evidence is overwhelming, even after everything has collapsed, she maintains enough doubt, enough mystery, enough compelling presence that her victims still aren't completely sure they've been conned. It's not just about lying convincingly. It's about creating such an elaborate illusion that people can't quite accept it was all fake, even when confronted with proof. To this day, the full extent of Cassie's spoils remains unknown. Some historians believe that many victims declined to come forward, too embarrassed to admit they'd been duped, too concerned about their reputations to publicly acknowledge their gullibility. Being conned carries a stigma. It suggests you were foolish, trusting, too easily manipulated. In the Gilded Age, when reputation was everything and business depended on being perceived as shrewd and capable, admitting you'd been scammed by a woman, which carried additional gender-based humiliation, was professionally devastating. The most commonly cited sum is $633,000, about $16.5 million in today's dollars. But this is almost certainly an underestimate. Given the number of victims, the size of the known loans, and the elaborate lifestyle she maintained, the actual total was likely significantly higher. Some estimates suggest she may have obtained as much as $2 million, equivalent to roughly $66 million today. For a woman who started with nothing but a hearing impairment and a talent for forgery, that's an impressive criminal career by any measure. In March 1905, after a trial that captivated the nation and filled newspapers with daily coverage of Gilded Age excess and criminality, Cassie Chadwick was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud a national bank and sentenced to 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. The trial itself was theater, with prosecutors detailing her elaborate schemes, defense attorneys attempting to paint her as a victim of misunderstanding, a difficult argument when the evidence included forged promissory notes, and witnesses recounting how they'd been duped. But the most dramatic moment came when Andrew Carnegie himself attended the trial. The man whose name had been used to perpetrate one of the most audacious financial frauds in American history sat in the courtroom and later had the chance to examine the infamous promissory notes that bore his forged signature. His reaction was perfect Carnegie, practical, dismissive, and slightly insulted that anyone had believed these obvious forgeries were legitimate. If anybody had seen this paper and then really believed that I had drawn it up and signed it, I could hardly have been flattered, he said, pointing out errors in spelling and punctuation that apparently his forgery-detecting abilities had immediately spotted. He added, with the tone of someone stating the obvious, "Why, I have not signed a note in the last 30 years." This was true. Carnegie was so wealthy that he didn't need to sign promissory notes. He dealt in stocks, bonds, direct transfers of property, not personal IOUs. Anyone with actual knowledge of how Carnegie conducted business would have known immediately that the notes were fake. But here's the thing. The bankers who'd accepted the notes as collateral didn't have that knowledge. They weren't personally acquainted with Carnegie. They didn't know his business practices. They just knew he was incredibly wealthy, and that a document bearing his signature was worth millions. The whole scandal could have been avoided, Carnegie added with barely concealed disdain, if anyone had bothered to ask him. And he was right. If any single banker, at any point in this multi-year con, had simply written to Carnegie or visited his office or sent a telegram saying, "Sir, is Cassie Chadwick your daughter, and did you sign these promissory notes?" the entire scheme would have collapsed immediately. But no one asked, because asking would have implied doubt, and doubt was insulting. If you questioned whether a woman was telling the truth about being an heiress, you were being rude, suspicious, and ungentlemanly. Social conventions and profit motives conspired to prevent the one simple action that would have exposed the fraud. Carnegie's attendance at the trial and his dismissive comments about the forgeries served a purpose. They protected his reputation. He wanted it absolutely clear that he had nothing to do with this woman, had never met her, had never signed anything for her. The speed and thoroughness of his denials suggest he was genuinely concerned that some stain of association might attach to his name. Cassie was sent to the Ohio State Penitentiary to serve her 10-year sentence. She was 57 years old, which in 1905 was considered fairly elderly, and her health was already declining from decades of stress, elaborate performances, and whatever toll living as multiple people simultaneously takes on a human body. Prison was a dramatic change from the Euclid Avenue mansion. No more 8 pianos at Christmas, no more $40,000 pearl necklaces, no more musical chairs or perpetual motion clocks. Just a cell, a uniform, and the company of other women who'd committed crimes for far less ambitious reasons. Cassie maintained her dignity in prison, reportedly, refusing to discuss her crimes or express genuine remorse. She'd been caught, sentenced, and imprisoned, but she hadn't been broken. She still carried herself with the air of someone who'd done something extraordinary, even if that extraordinary thing was criminal. Her health deteriorated rapidly in prison. The combination of age, stress, and the harsh conditions of early 20th century incarceration took their toll. Within months of her imprisonment, she became seriously ill. On October 10, 1907, less than 3 years into her sentence, Cassie Chadwick died in prison. The official cause of death was heart disease and hardening of the arteries. Her body simply gave out under the accumulated strain of decades of fraud, stress, and performance. She was 59 years old, which seems tragically young by modern standards, but was actually a reasonable lifespan for someone born in 1857. She'd outlived most of her childhood siblings, outlived several of her husbands, some naturally, some suspiciously, and outlived her reputation. The newspapers that had breathlessly covered her trial gave her death brief mention. "Cassie Chadwick dies in prison," read the headlines, summarizing an extraordinarily complicated life in 5 words. There were no extended obituaries, no reflections on her remarkable criminal career, no analysis of what her cons revealed about Gilded Age society. She was buried in an unmarked grave. Her real name, Elizabeth Bigley, largely forgotten, her various aliases and personas scattered across decades of fraud. Even in death, she remained somewhat mysterious, somewhat unknowable, a collection of performances rather than a single coherent person. What happened to Dr. Leroy Chadwick deserves mention, because he was perhaps the most complicated victim in this entire affair. He'd married Cassie, knowing at least some of her history, the rumors about her past, the whispers about her previous life. Whether he knew the full extent of her criminal record is unclear, but he wasn't entirely ignorant of who she was. When Cassie's fraud was exposed, Dr. Chadwick faced public humiliation. His wife was a conwoman. His home had been purchased with stolen money. His social standing in Cleveland's elite circles evaporated overnight. He went from being a respected physician and member of a founding family to being that doctor who married the conwoman. He claimed ignorance of her schemes, insisting he'd had no idea she was borrowing millions under false pretenses. Given the separate financial lives married couples often maintained in this era, this is plausible. But it's also possible he chose not to ask too many questions about where the money for 8 pianos and $40,000 pearl necklaces was coming from. When the scandal broke, Dr. Chadwick and his adult daughter from his first marriage hastily left Cleveland for a European tour, which is 19th century speak for fled the country in embarrassment. He filed for divorce before departing, severing his legal connection to Cassie as quickly as possible. Dr. Chadwick died in 1910, 3 years after Cassie. His reputation never fully recovered. The Chadwick mansion on Euclid Avenue was sold to satisfy debts. His connection to one of America's greatest financial frauds became the primary fact people remembered about him, overshadowing his decades of medical practice and his family's contributions to Cleveland. He was collateral damage in Cassie's elaborate performance, one of many people whose lives were permanently altered by their encounter with a woman who'd spent her entire life pretending to be someone else. And then there was Emil Hoover, Cassie's son, perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire story because he never chose any of it. Born around 1886 or 1887 to Cassie and her second husband C.L. Hoover, Emil spent his earliest years being shuttled around like unwanted luggage. When he was still a small child, Cassie sent him to Canada to be raised by her parents and siblings, essentially farming out the inconvenient responsibility of motherhood so she could focus on her various criminal enterprises. Imagine being told as a child that your mother loves you, but also that you need to go live with grandparents in another country because she's too busy committing fraud to raise you. It's the kind of childhood that requires extensive therapy, except therapy didn't really exist yet in any meaningful way. Emil spent his formative years in Canada, probably hearing stories about his mysterious mother, wondering why she'd sent him away, trying to understand his place in a family that seemed to have relegated him to the margins. When Cassie married Dr. Leroy Chadwick in 1897, she suddenly decided she wanted to play the role of mother again. She sent for Emil, now about 11 years old, and moved him into the palatial Chadwick mansion on Euclid Avenue. The 1900 census lists him as Emil Chadwick, suggesting Dr. Chadwick either adopted him or at least allowed him to use the family name. For a few years, Emil lived in extraordinary luxury. The mansion, the servants, the endless parade of expensive items his mother purchased. It must have been overwhelming for a boy who'd grown up in rural Canada. He went from modest circumstances to millionaire's row, from obscurity to being the stepson of one of Cleveland's most prominent physicians. But here's the uncomfortable question. Did Emil know what his mother was doing? Did he understand that the wealth surrounding him was built on fraud? Was he aware of the forged promissory notes, the false claims about Carnegie, the web of lies that funded their lifestyle? It's unclear whether Dr. Chadwick knew Cassie had a son when he married her. The historical record is deliberately vague on this point, suggesting that either Cassie hid Emil's existence initially, or Dr. Chadwick preferred not to discuss his wife's complicated past, including the child from a previous marriage. When Cassie's scheme collapsed in 1904, Emil was about 18 years old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to read the newspapers that gleefully detailed his mother's crimes, old enough to feel the shame of being associated with America's most notorious conwoman. While Dr. Chadwick and his adult daughter fled to Europe to escape the scandal, Emil's fate during the trial: did he stay in Cleveland? Did he testify? Did he visit his mother in jail during the trial? The sources don't say, which suggests he deliberately stayed out of the public eye, trying to avoid being dragged further into his mother's disaster. What we do know is that Emil visited Cassie in prison while she was serving her sentence. He was 20 years old when 3 weeks before her death, he came to the Ohio State Penitentiary to see his mother. During that visit, Cassie suddenly collapsed, probably a heart attack or stroke, and was confined to the prison hospital. She remained there, her health deteriorating rapidly, until she died on October 10, 1907, on her 50th birthday. Emil was summoned from Cleveland when the end was near, but he arrived just 15 minutes too late. His mother died before he could say goodbye, before he could have any final conversation, before he could ask all the questions he probably had. In the days before her death, Cassie had written letters to Emil, her final communications to the son she'd alternately abandoned and reclaimed throughout his life. In one letter, she gave him explicit instructions. She told him about hidden funds, money she'd secreted away somewhere, and instructed him to use a portion of it to purchase a tombstone for the family plot in Canada. This raises fascinating questions. Did Emil find the hidden money? Did it actually exist, or was this another of Cassie's elaborate fictions? Was she still lying even on her deathbed, creating false hope for her son about secret wealth that never existed? Or had she actually managed to hide some of her spoils, squirreling away a nest egg that would help Emil after her death? The historical record is silent on whether Emil ever found any hidden funds. Given Cassie's lifetime of lies and the thorough investigation into her finances during the trial, it's entirely possible the money was fictional, one last con, except this time directed at her own son. Cassie was buried in Woodstock, Ontario, in the town of her birth, in an unmarked grave in the Episcopal Cemetery. Whether Emil followed through on her request to purchase a tombstone is unknown. Whether he attended the funeral is unknown. Whether he ever forgave her for the life she'd given him, alternately abandoned and reclaimed, surrounded by wealth that turned out to be stolen, bearing the name of America's most famous conwoman, is unknown. After his mother's death, Emil Hoover essentially disappears from the historical record. He was about 21 years old, with no inheritance except infamy, no family except the relatives in Canada who'd raised him when his mother couldn't be bothered. No clear future in a country where his mother's name was synonymous with fraud. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't give interviews. He didn't try to capitalize on his mother's notoriety or defend her reputation. He simply vanished into obscurity, which was probably exactly what he wanted, to be anyone except Cassie Chadwick's son. There's something deeply sad about Emil's story. He was the only truly innocent victim in Cassie's web of lies, a child who didn't choose his mother, didn't participate in her crimes, but suffered the consequences anyway. While the bankers who'd been conned could eventually rebuild their reputations and recover financially, Emil carried a burden that money couldn't fix, being the son of a conwoman, forever associated with her crimes, forever wondering whether the woman who'd given birth to him had ever actually loved him, or if he'd just been another prop in her endless performance. His mother had become so many people: Elizabeth Bigley, Marie Rosa, Lydia DeVere, Cassie Hoover, Cassie Chadwick, that it's unclear if she'd ever really been anyone at all. And Emil, more than anyone, must have struggled with that question. Who was his mother, really? Behind all the aliases and cons and performances, was there ever a real person? And if there was, did that person ever genuinely care about the son she kept sending away? We'll never know the answers. Emil took whatever knowledge he had to his grave, choosing silence over explanation, obscurity over notoriety. In a life defined by his mother's frauds and fictions, his disappearance from history might have been the most honest thing anyone in this story ever did. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Cassie Chadwick case is how many victims never came forward. The documented losses of $633,000 to $2 million represent only the people willing to publicly admit they'd been conned. How many other bankers, businessmen, and wealthy individuals had lent her money and chosen silence over public humiliation? How many had written off their losses rather than admit to their boards, their investors, their families, that they'd been duped by a woman claiming to be Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter without ever verifying this claim? The Gilded Age operated on reputation and appearance. Admitting you'd been fooled, especially by someone like Cassie, was worse than losing the money. The financial loss was temporary, the reputational damage was permanent. So people stayed quiet. They absorbed their losses. They told themselves and others that the money had been lost to legitimate business ventures or bad investments, anything except the truth. That they'd believed an obvious lie because they'd wanted it to be true. Because the possibility of lending money to Andrew Carnegie's daughter and earning significant interest was too appealing to question. This suggests that Cassie's actual take may have been substantially higher than the document. Some estimates put it as high as $5 million in 1905 dollars, roughly $165 million today, which would make her one of the most successful financial criminals in American history. Looking at Cassie's career, several factors contributed to her extraordinary success as a conwoman. She understood social conventions and used them as weapons. Questioning a woman's story about her parentage was rude. Demanding verification of her claims was ungentlemanly. Social pressure prevented the kind of due diligence that would have immediately exposed her fraud. She chose victims carefully. She targeted wealthy men who had something to gain from believing her story. Bankers could earn interest on large loans. Businessmen could establish connections with Carnegie's family. Everyone wanted something, and that want made them willing to overlook obvious red flags. She created elaborate but plausible stories. She didn't claim to be Carnegie's acknowledged daughter. That would be too easy to disprove. She claimed to be his illegitimate daughter, a secret he was ashamed of, something he would naturally deny if asked. This preemptively explained why Carnegie himself would say he didn't know her. She used real institutions and real people as props. She visited Carnegie's actual mansion. She deposited forged notes in real banks. She created promissory notes that looked legitimate because they were based on real financial instruments. The con had just enough reality mixed with fiction that people couldn't easily distinguish between them. She spent lavishly and publicly. Nothing validates wealth claims like actual spending. If she'd borrowed money and lived modestly, people would have questioned her story. But she bought 8 pianos, wore $40,000 in pearls, threw extravagant parties. The spending itself became evidence that she really was wealthy, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of belief. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, she understood that people believe what they want to believe. The bankers wanted to believe they were making smart loans to a Carnegie heiress. The socialites wanted to believe they were friends with Carnegie's daughter. Dr. Chadwick wanted to believe his young wife loved him. Everyone had reasons to accept her lies, and she exploited those reasons perfectly. Cassie Chadwick's success says something important about the Gilded Age itself. This was an era of massive wealth accumulation, loose banking regulations, and social structures based entirely on reputation and appearance rather than verified facts. Banks would lend enormous sums based on collateral they never properly examined. Social circles would accept new members based on claims they never verified. Business deals were made on handshakes and assumptions rather than background checks and documentation. The same conditions that allowed Carnegie, Rockefeller, and other industrialists to build massive fortunes through aggressive, sometimes questionable business practices also allowed someone like Cassie to build a fortune through outright fraud. The system was designed to reward boldness and punish caution, to favor those willing to take risks and ask forgiveness rather than permission. In this context, Cassie wasn't an aberration. She was a logical product of her environment. She'd learned that appearance mattered more than reality, that confidence could substitute for credentials, that people would believe almost anything if it was presented with sufficient conviction. She was, in a sense, doing what every successful Gilded Age figure did, creating value through perception rather than substance, building wealth through manipulation of systems and people, and understanding that reality is less important than what people believe reality to be. The difference is that when Carnegie did it, it was called business. When Cassie did it, it was called fraud. The line between the two was thinner than comfortable. Elizabeth Bigley, who became Betty Bigley, who became Marie Rosa, who became Madame Rosa, who became Lydia Dare, who became Cassie Hoover, who became Cassie Chadwick. This woman, who was so many people, that it's unclear if anyone, including herself, knew who she really was. Left behind several legacies. She demonstrated vulnerabilities in the banking system that led to reforms. After her case, banks became more careful about verifying collateral, more skeptical of claims that seemed too good to be true, more willing to actually contact the people allegedly backing large loans. She challenged assumptions about women's capabilities. The prevailing belief was that women weren't intelligent or devious enough to perpetrate sophisticated financial fraud. Cassie proved otherwise. She was smarter than most of the men she conned, more creative than the bankers who should have caught her, more strategic than the lawyers who tried to prosecute her. She exposed the hollowness of Gilded Age society. The same people who'd enthusiastically welcomed her into their circles, who'd attended her parties and admired her pearls, turned on her instantly when her fraud was revealed. There was no loyalty, no benefit of doubt, just immediate rejection once she no longer served their purposes. She inspired countless other con artists. Her techniques, creating elaborate backstories, forging documents, using real institutions as props, spending lavishly to validate claims of wealth, became standard practices in financial fraud. She wrote the playbook that others would follow. Finally, she remains a compelling figure because her story asks uncomfortable questions about identity, authenticity, and truth. Was there ever a real Elizabeth Bigley beneath all the personas? Or had she performed so many roles for so long that the original person was lost? When you spend your entire life pretending to be other people, do you eventually become them? Or do you become nothing at all? Elizabeth Betty Bigley was born into modest circumstances on a Canadian farm, marked by physical afflictions that could have limited her life to a narrow, unremarkable existence. Instead, she became one of the most successful criminals of her era, a master of metamorphosis, who wove her way through the gilded threads of deceit with the artistry of a grand illusionist. She understood something profound about human nature. People see what they expect to see. If you present yourself as wealthy, people assume you are. If you act with confidence, people assume you belong. If you create convincing enough paperwork, institutions will trust you. With each new alias, from Marie Rosa to Lydia Dare to Cassie Hoover to Cassie Chadwick, she reinvented herself to fit the backdrop of her latest scheme, leaving a trail of forgery, fictitious identities, and mesmerized victims in her wake. She married strategically, spent extravagantly, lied convincingly, and maintained her performance even when caught. Her life was a tapestry of elaborate cons and dramatic reversals that mirrored the very fictions she crafted, ultimately blurring the lines between the woman she truly was and the personas she assumed. Did she even remember who Elizabeth Bigley had been? Or had that frightened, hearing-impaired girl from Ontario been so thoroughly buried under layers of performance that she'd ceased to exist? Through her relentless ingenuity and the seductive power of her invented narratives, Betty Bigley emerged not just as a figure of infamy, but as a dark legend etched into the annals of criminal law. A true architect of deception, whose methods and madness revealed as much about the society she conned as about her own twisted genius. She spent her life pretending to be other people, and in the end, she died as someone no one, possibly not even herself, truly knew. She was buried in an unmarked grave, her real name, largely forgotten, remembered primarily as Cassie Chadwick, the woman who claimed to be Andrew Carnegie's daughter and almost got away with it. Her story serves as a reminder that the greatest cons aren't about the money. They're about understanding human nature, exploiting social conventions, and recognizing that reality is negotiable when everyone involved has reasons to believe the lie. Cassie Chadwick convinced some of America's smartest, wealthiest, most powerful men to hand over millions of dollars based on nothing more than forged documents and a compelling performance. She did this not once, but dozens of times. Not for a few months, but for years. Not in obscurity, but in the heart of Cleveland's elite society. And even after she was caught, even after she died in prison, even after Andrew Carnegie himself called her forgeries obvious fakes, some of her victims still weren't entirely sure she'd been lying. Good night.